So nice to see. The microphone is here. So then you'll put it back. It doesn't matter if you see me. I'm going to welcome everybody. So everybody, welcome to our annual One Book, One Jewish Community at TBA event. Just a bit of history for those who are not familiar with the One Book, One Jewish Community program. One Book, One Jewish Community engages readers from across Greater Philadelphia in books that speak to diverse aspects of Jewish identity and community. One Book, which was launched in 2006 as an initiative of Jewish Outreach Partnership, now Jewish Learning Venture, has been led by Gratz College since 2019, and it's found a very lovely home there. The program's kickoff event with the author is just a springboard to more programs and discussions among groups and individuals within our Jewish community and beyond. Thus, our program today is an outreach of the initial program. I've been privileged to be part of the implementation team of One Book since the beginning and served as its chair for many years. This year's selection, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present by Dara Horn, is a startling exploration of how Jewish history is exploited to comfort the living. Reflecting on various subjects, Dara Horn challenges us to confront the reasons why there might be so much fascination with Jewish details as emblematic of the worst of evils the world has to offer, and so little respect for Jewish lives as they continue to unfold in the present. Many of you here and here on Zoom, including our TBA book club, have read the book. But if you have not, this presentation will be just as meaningful for you. Our presenter is Zev Eleff, the 12th and youngest president of Gratz College, who served as our interviewer at the One Book kickoff event with Dara Horn. Rabbi Eleff comes to the Philadelphia area from the Chicago area after serving as chief academic officer of Hebrew Theological College and vice provost of Touro College. He is the author of 9 books and numerous articles in the field of Jewish studies and American religion, and the recipient of numerous awards for his research. Dr. Eleff received his PhD from Brandeis University and MA from Teachers College, Columbia University. At Yeshiva University, he graduated from Yeshiva College and received an ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elechanan Theological Seminary. He is a past Wexner Graduate Fellow, Davidson Scholar. There's a lot more I could add. If you're interested, check out his bio on the Gratz College website. For the past 8 weeks, I was fortunate to take part in learning with Dr. Eleff on Zoom. The course was the history of anti-Semitism. While quite a downer subject, Dr. Eleff was the absolute best presenter and discussion leader. We are fortunate to have him here this afternoon, and now to speak about dead Jews and American anti-Semitism, a call for the living.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And I'm glad for my mother offering to write most of the bio and for your wonderful remarks about our class. It was really a challenge. I'm a very upbeat person generally, but unfortunately, anti-Semitism is quite timely. There's also quite a bit of a challenge because as just make sure I have enough space in my pockets. You know, to put my work in context with Dara Horn, Dr. Dara Horn, that's a challenge. It really, really is to be able to speak to what she was able to accomplish. I joked when I was in graduate school. It's not a joke. I aspired to be the Dara Horn of nonfiction, and she has the audacity to become the Dara Horn of nonfiction. Now I have to find something else. So if we could put up the PowerPoint, otherwise I'm Batman without a utility belt. And I thought also, it's over here. Can it be placed over? Great, wonderful. But I'll put Dara Horn's really wonderful work, her episodic work of People Loved Jews, into conversation with another very important person, happily in the news for a happy reason. We were able to push her appointment in as really essentially a new ambassador, overseer of anti-Semitism, a brand new position altogether. And I can't think of anybody more befitting to occupy the position than Professor Deborah Lipstadt. And she has a book that came out a number of years ago, not too long, about 2 or 3 years ago at this point, Anti-Semitism Here and Now. Really motivated in her introduction based on what had happened in Charlottesville, unfortunately. In most instances, we could talk about an episode in anti-Semitism, so that was the most recent event. But in that case, there have been a number of cases that have appeared since then. And Lipstadt has the following in the middle of her book, but I was quite taken by that. And normally we cherry pick the introduction or the conclusion, but here there was something in the middle of the work and her taxonomy of what is the vocabulary of anti-Semitism in America. And Dr. Horn focuses much on America. Of course, she takes us all the way from Russia and Japan, all the way to Germany and the Netherlands. For our purposes this afternoon, I want to grapple with what's uniquely American about anti-Semitism. Professor Lipstadt offers the following. In her taxonomy, there's this clueless anti-Semite, as opposed to some of the more deliberate or intentional anti-Semitism. The clueless anti-Semite is an otherwise nice and well-meaning person who is completely unaware that she, or he in this case, is completely unaware that she has internalized anti-Semitic stereotypes and is perpetrating them. There are, of course, also Jews who intentionally or unintentionally, so equal opportunity, traffic anti-Semitic stereotypes. So I want to focus on this afternoon. It's very easy to identify the most vitriolic forms of anti-Semitism. We understand that could go into the politics of anti-Semitism, talk about the protocols of the elders of Zion, this mythical work that suppose that Jews are the puppeteers that can control the world. There is, I'll stay in the center. There is the anti-Semitism that is racial, the one that is theological, that accuses Jews of deicide, of killing, of being responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. Those are all very deliberate, I almost want to use the word thoughtful anti-Semitism. And then there's anti-Semitism that comes in our language. The stuff that looks a little bit like eugenics, that looks a little bit like we're stereotyping, looks a little bit like we're making generalizations for a very complicated, small, but complicated group of people. And it's a question of language. It's a question of how do we speak? How do we traffic? Or how is our vocabulary freighted with terminologies, with terms, with words, with vocabulary that sometimes we, Jews, non-Jews, take for granted. And that's what I want to explore today. The clueless, as she would call it, Professor Lipstadt has, the clueless anti-Semites. If we go to the next page, thanks so much for moving me along. So here's some of my collection. Unfortunately, I've grown a rather large collection of anti-Semitica over the years. And in the early 20th century, as the American Jewish population increased from 1880, from 250,000, from 250,000 Jews. If we go further back, about time of Revolution, there were about 1,000 Jews in the country. Right after the Revolution, after New York was occupied by the British, so Philadelphia became the largest Jewish community. That's why Mikveh Israel today, I think there are several congregations that claim to be the first So New York Sheretz Israel claims to be as old as the first Jews who arrived on the St. Catherine in 1654. That's probably pushing it, but the 1720s will say. Mikveh Israel claims to be the longest standing congregation uninterrupted. Until 1784, New York's Jews couldn't return back to Gotham City. And Newport claims to be the oldest congregation in one single building. So Philadelphia does claim it first. The population in the beginning of the 1800s was maybe 2,000, imprecise census of sorts, 1,000 Jews. By 1880, there were 250,000. By 1900, however, the Jewish population numbered 1 million. And by 1920, before legislation closed the gates to Eastern European Jews, which was in no small way an anti-Semitic piece of legislation, that number had moved to probably 4 million, which is why many of my colleagues, when they teach American Jewish history on the undergraduate or the graduate level, will say the real stuff happens after 1880, because that's when you have a critical mass. Now, I teach from before then, but point is well taken. And the assumption in the anti-Semitic circles, if you take a look at some of these images, is that when you had a boat coming into Ellis Island, it was a Jewish boat. And all these boats, Jews from Germany, Jews from Austria, Jews from Spain, all of them. And here is the Statue of Liberty saying, hold it, stop already. We have enough Jews in this country. And if you go to the next slide, that carries forward. And here is Roosevelt's ideal 9 old men, referring to, and also there is a Jewish world plot, Jews say so. This is Philip Roth made it quite famous that with Charles Lindbergh and the plot against the Jews in America. Here you have cartoons which much predate Roth's work. The supposition is that the Jews are controlling the politics, international politics after FDR. But then there's, thank you so much. Then there is an anti-Semitism, which is less acute, which is, I'm going to say, smuggled along, which is trafficked along through the language that we use. And if you click, you'll see just one time, you'll see that here's an article from the Brooklyn Eagle, not a Jewish newspaper, by a fellow named Leopold Cohen, which actually turned out in time to be a missionary. But he writes the following, and it sums up the views of sentiments of many Jews in the public school system. In those days, there were no day schools. In those days, what was the great agent of Americanization for all of those Jews who migrated from Europe to America? It was the public school. To the contrary, if you decided that you were going to send your kid to one of the cheters, to one of the day schools, people questioned, didn't you move to America for a reason? How is your child going to Americanize, socialize to American norms if it's not for the public school? And when you have your child attend public school, the parents get into an English language, almost like what we call an ulpan, to Americanize. The Daily Forward, the Yiddish press, every couple of years used to produce an image of a baseball diamond in Yiddish language to explain to the reader how to play baseball, because you could not be American if you didn't know baseball. How did your child learn all that? How would they matriculate to a city college or Hunter College, 2 major schools? City College was 91% Jewish at one point. Why City College? A, because it was free in those times, but also because there were steep quotas instituted both at NYU and Columbia College. But sometimes the public school wasn't always cracked up to be. So Cohen writes the following: prejudice against the Hebrew race already runs high in New York, constantly exhibited, and excretion and even in overt acts of persecution. And shall we then foster in the children this anti-Jewish sentiment? What's going on here? What are public schools indoctrinating of anti-Semitism, which has never failed to work evil upon the oppressor of the Jew, from the death of the firstborn in Egypt to the disgrace of the general staff in France? This is about Ivanhoe. a great and very important British novel at the time. And supposing, which is actually based one of the characters on Rebecca Gratz, who of course is one of the founders, in essence, of Gratz College. But you take a look even below that in the next paragraph. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll read it to you. Absolutely.
Microphone closer.
Closer to me.
Higher up, yeah.
Absolutely. The same objections obtain in the case of the Merchant of Venice. It is untrue to the facts. Dr. Peters of New York, the superintendent at the time in Manhattan, has just shown that, as a matter of history, the pound of flesh was cut by the merchant from the Jew, the exact reversal of Shakespeare's story. And thus, in the school's falsehood is made, not exactly clear what that means, to the pander to prejudice. So much was made of the Merchant of Venice. And you'll see that. Go to the next, which of course, the villain is Shylock, is this Jew. You have so many Shakespearean plays. Why do you have to teach the Merchant of Venice? They complained, but there was pushback in the same Brooklyn newspapers. You see from this attack, it's pretty small, but they defend it in the sense that, how could Shakespeare be anti-Semitism? If you're going to be Western, don't you have to absorb it? And what's missing here argument isn't anti-Semitism or not, but if you study it, aren't you trafficking that clueless form of anti-Semitism has been put in full display in the next set of slides, please? Thank you very much. Push it one more time. By David Phillipson. Rabbi David Phillipson was one of the first 3 ordinees at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati at the time, was one of the leaders, the head of the CCAR for many years, one of the leading reform figures in the early 20th century. And he writes the superintendent in the early 20th century about the Merchant of Venice, superintendent of Cincinnati. It's not an abstract idea of justice. If you go back, let's click the next one. I want to make sure that we see everything. Here you see, push the next one and I'll summarize it. It's a little bit smaller than I had hoped. What is the argument is that the public school has to be free of anti-Semitism, argues Phillipson. If this is going to be the agent of pluralism, if this is going to be the portal of entry where Italians, where Irish, where Puritan descendant Americans come into the public school along with Jews, then we're doing something wrong if we are introducing any form of anti-Semitic language. Isn't an attack on Shakespeare per se to say that Shakespeare is an anti-Semite. In all likelihood, Shakespeare did not meet a Jew, but to use that text is to misunderstand the importance of what Phillipson argues is being a good American. A good American doesn't mean that you treat everybody fairly, but it's that you give opportunities. And in our arenas, education being the most important of all of them, in which we are trying to cultivate a sense of pluralism, a sense of Americanization of all people to get along, then The Merchant of Venice ought not to be your Shakespeare comedy of choice. Thank you so much. I want to look at as in a couple of more episodes in which maybe people take for granted. We got a little bit colorful. Dara Horn's episodes are so creative. I had to get a little more creative for this presentation. I want to take a look at two. Anybody know who these two people are? On the left, not wearing his derby or his mustache, Charlie Chaplin. And in the most important biography of Chaplin by David Robinson, I think it was first published in the 1980s. Chaplin's first recorded statement in the beginning of the book. We don't know much about Charlie Chaplin's early life. He had a very sad he actually had a very sad life, despite being probably the most well-known person next to Thomas Edison of the early 20th century. Chaplin's first recorded statement on the question of his religion, dates from 1915. when a reporter asked him, as was supposed, he was Jewish. After all, he's in Hollywood, even at that early stage, supposing that all of Hollywood was somehow Jewish. With the grace he so often mustered in the face of the press, Chaplin replied, "I have not that good fortune." This was not an empty courtesy. Throughout his life, Chaplin would continue to express a profound admiration for the race. Interesting language, Judaism as a race, which in itself would certainly have led him to acknowledge any Jewish origins. He would have claimed it. He held it in high esteem. On a boat returning from Europe in 1921, he told a small girl who was a fellow passenger, "All great geniuses have Jewish blood in them. No, I am not Jewish, but I am sure there must be some somewhere in me." I hope so. And probably harder to identify is the fellow on the top, in the top center. That is Jay Gould, probably the most hated of all of the robber barons, who also was accused of being Jewish. Gould was probably a little bit shorter than I am. Long beard, looked quite rabbinic, and because he had tried to corner the market on gold, but Ulysses S. Grant, then president of the United States, wouldn't let him do it. He developed a very nasty reputation. The other robber barons didn't care for him either, Cornelius Vanderbilt being the lead one of them. And if you can see the text here that I've reproduced is another biography of Jay Gould, in which many of the accusations were made that he was Jewish after all. He was shrewd in business, quite wealthy, seemed to control the railway and telegraph industry. So he was Jewish, but Jay Gould, much like Chaplin, didn't disregard these. To the contrary. He never refuted them whatsoever because it seemed to feed into this presentation, this persona of being this evil genius during the late 19th century. Both instances, while mild, speak to how what happens when we don't. Even these are interesting cases because these aren't Jews. And nevertheless, to subtly not endorse, but to leverage the reputation. Certainly, there were wonderful people in Hollywood who were Jewish. There were people who were wonderful who weren't Jewish. There were miserable Jewish actors the same way that there were miserable Gentiles in Hollywood at the time. I've met some very wealthy Jews in my time. I've met some people who aren't among the wealthiest class of people. The fact that we can use these stereotypes and to say that there is a certain almost bone structure, a DNA, and we work to try to figure out what are the characteristics of a group of people, so much so that we call them a race, which is really interesting. Right now, thank goodness for the 2020 Pew study of Jewish Americans, much was made over Jews of color. Somehow suggest that not every Jew is white, would identify in such a way, but the fact that we carry these forward, it propagates, it popularizes certain stereotypes which feed into that more latent, that more subterranean sense of anti-Semitism. Thanks a lot. If we can expand those, press it the first time. Just once. One more time. Good. Let's go to sports. Go to Hollywood, go to robber barons. Let's spend a little bit of time in Jews and sports. Boxers with queer names. This predates and the current incarnation of what we mean by queer, you'll understand. Boxers with queer names. Some gents, this is from a New York newspaper, use in the ring, use the prefix kid is popular. Of the large number of pugilists, a fancy word for a boxer, before the public, very few fight under their real names. Use a nom de plume. Like some actors, not Chaplin, they believe that an assumed cognomen is essential to success. It is only after a boxer has achieved any kind of fame that the sport becomes interested in the history of the man and ascertain the fighter's correct name. Years ago, a fighter was not so particular in concealing his name from the public. His name was a source of pride to him, and he fought to show that he was a chip of the old block, which Interesting is that in all likelihood, who are they referring to is Benny Leonard, who is interesting about name changes. This was in the book. Christine Vermegla wrote a wonderful book called A Rosenberg, very clever title, Rosenberg by Any Other Name, and it's a chapter in Dara Horn's book. It's interesting how Jews changed their name. They didn't change to McConaughey. They didn't change their names whole hog, so to speak, to Bingham. They changed their name to something subtly that was both American and Jewish, but certainly in fighting in the ring. And we'll see also in playing football, there was a bit of name changing. So if you click on the next, we make the other one quite large. Before there was Greenberg and Koufax, there was a fellow by the name of Arnie Harween. In the 1910s and 1920s, who was the first Jew to both be captain of the Harvard Crimson. That was when the Harvard football team, believe it or not, was part of the big three. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton is where football really was cultivated. Ironically, it was invented at McGill, go figure, in Canada. But here is a sermon about this newfangled thing called the Jewish Center in American Jewish life. And Louis Newman, Rabbi Louis Newman, was a leading New York Reform rabbi at the time who was interested in combating the Jewish quotas, not by convincing, for example, Nicholas Murray Butler, then president of Columbia University, that you're making a wrong decision, you should admit Jews. He thought it would be more advantageous to create something that he liked to call a menorah university. The founders of Brandeis would give him a lot of credit by 1948 when Brandeis was created, but at the time it wasn't quite popular. Why? Because that's not how Jews Americanize. That's how you don't create a separate institution. That's how, for example, Irish Catholics like to Americanize. We don't want to attend your college and play football. We want to found Georgetown, Boston College, Notre Dame, and we'll beat the snot out of you there. We want to create parochial. I mentioned about public schools. Catholics were very big, for example. Not all Catholics, I don't make generalizations, particularly not in a talk like this. But the Catholic establishment liked to create parallel institutions. Jews wanted to enter into the American mainstream. And so Rabbi Louis Newman's attempt to found a menorah university was considered to be ill-advised by many of the Jewish elite at the time. But one example he gave to push his cause was the following. The quota will be kept down to its authorized fraction. Did Harvard realize when it introduced into its questionnaire, it had a very strict policy for admissions in the 1920s. The problem was that Arnie Harween was admitted to Harvard in 1916, so the story is not true. But the fact that it was elevated to part of the mythos of the American Jewish experience is important. Did Harvard realize when it introduced into its questionnaire the interrogation, has there been any change in your family name? That is true. That the Harvard questionnaire that was imposed by its president, A. Lawrence Lowell, did ask very invasive questions about surnames, your mother's maiden name, for instance, even asked for a passport photo to judge if you had a Jewish look. That its football captain of 1920 would have been compelled as an applicant for admission to say that though his name was Harween, his nom de ghetto, meaning his name before he had changed it, had been Harwitz. Well, it's actually not true. His father, Isidore Harween, we know from his, we know when he de-shipped, when I look at the ship manifest, we know that he came to Ellis Island with the name Harween, not Harwitz, but the supposition, the possibility that he had to commit a name change in order to convert to a certain elite New England American vibe and culture, whereas the pressure that Jews did place on themselves to change themselves. And that too is a form of anti-Semitism. Now, it is true that Arnie Harween did change his name, but not the way that Rabbi Louis Newman had anticipated. If you press the button once more, Arnie Harween was quite good. In fact, the one time Harvard is 1-0 in postseason play in its history, the one time it was invited to the Rose Bowl on New Year's 1920, they defeated Oregon. Time they were known as the Webfoots. They were quite smart to change the name to the Ducks. But Arnie and his brother Ralph didn't have their fill completely of football. So when they returned to Chicago, they still wanted to play football. And they were lucky that just the year prior, professional football was born. And so one of the teams there was known by the name of Chicago Cardinals. Now they're the Arizona Cardinals. It actually predates the Chicago Bears. And the story goes, we have it from a number of sources, but this is the most extravagant description of it, is that Arnie and Ralph marched into the Chicago Cardinal offices. Now, who played football at that time? Working class Americans, usually immigrants or the children of immigrants, because this predates FDR, this predates the New Deal or any social reforms. So if you got laid out by a big hit, that was it. You couldn't go back to work. There was no Social Security. This wasn't collegiate football. This wasn't the effort to become a man and a gentleman by playing at Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, or eventually some of the other colleges as well. This was something quite seedy in the early 1920s. So then you'll understand, and here's a little side story. The Harween brothers went to the management of the Cardinals. "We want to play," they said simply, and "Who might you be?" queried their best player, then quarterback, Patty Driscoll, Hall of Famer, I believe, formerly a star at Northwestern and the Great Lakes Training Station team. "Who might you be?" "Well, I'm Arnold Harween. This is my brother Ralph." "Good Lord," gasped Driscoll, "not the Harweens." "Why, that's fine. We'll play you up." "Why, I've got newspaper friends." "I know you won't," said the Harweens, and they explained, "We'll be McMahons." They said, "We want to be anonymous. We don't want publicity, and we don't want a whole lot of money." Their father did quite well in the leather industry, isn't it, Harween? "We do want to play football," and play football they did. There's a wonderful story. It's actually a book that that's in the late stages of production right now about Arnie Harween in Harvard. But suffice for our discussion this afternoon is that Harween did change his name, right? Almost 2 cases of more subtle racism. Not that he meant it, but his mother was adamant. "You will not play professional football. Your father and I have worked too hard. We sent you to a private school fashioned after the philosophies of John Dewey. It's called Francis Parker in Chicago, still one of the elite schools in America and certainly in Chicago today. We sent you to Harvard. You're not going to squander the good name that we've been cultivating by playing professional football." Now, there are those who say that they also don't want to besmirch the good reputation of Harvard. Okay, either way, Harween couldn't play under his name because it sounded too Jewish or too much like it shared the same name as his parents. So he went by McMahon, which is, again, it's a reminder about how some of the language we use, some of the decisions we make in protecting their Jewishness, they had to somehow surrender the good reputation of the Irish Catholic population, go by the McMahon brothers in that time. And a little bit more on Harween. It's worth reading some of this. It's if you take a look, if you can see it on right about here, is a letter a few years later in 1926, Henry Pennypacker, who was actually the director of admissions at Harvard, who was guilty of carrying out A. Lawrence Lowell's quota system at Harvard College. He writes the following. He's a member of the search committee for a new head coach at Harvard College football, the Crimson. He writes after visiting Chicago about this name he's heard, about consideration in the third line of Arnold Harween as head coach of football, or failing that, as assistant coach. He has had much success, a successful experience, both in playing and in coaching the Cardinals, a professional football team here, that's Chicago. And these men say that he is only, anybody read that? Half Jewish. His mother being of the Greek nobility. It's not true. Rose Harween was born from Jewish stock. So therefore, all of a sudden, he was redeemed, was Arnold Harween. He's only half Jewish. This predates Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song, after all. And so he was an acceptable person, potentially, to coach the Harvard Crimson. Well, what happens by the time Pennypacker has taken the train, now he's in Texas and in Houston, they know their football. He writes back to the search committee chair, Fred Moore, at the Harvard Club luncheon here this noon, a very strong plea was made for the next page, that was the larger version that you can see. Since writing you from Chicago, here I gave you the transcription, I have spoken with a considerable number of men in this part of the country, Texas. And I am really doubtful if we could expediently invite any member of the human race to become head coach, no matter how skillful he might be. There is a settled feeling, apparently very widespread, that we must do something at once to check certain growing influences, and that Arnold Harween's appointment in the present ticklish situation, right? See certain coded language here, would be perilous. In the end, thankfully, the search committee did appoint Arnold Harween, and it was a remarkable story, but it's one for another time. Oh boy, that is small. Press the button one more time. There we go. Now here is a little known story about probably the most famous Jewish athlete, Jewish player number 1 on the O'Malley want list. This is from no small newspaper, the Sporting News. Until ESPN put it out of business, this was the sports paper of record. It was a weekly, actually. At that time, Walter O'Malley, head man of the Brooklyn Dodgers, believes a Jewish player of top ability and an Italian diamond performer will provide the answer to the Dodgers' quest for a world's championship. Who did he have in mind? Well, after all, it wasn't so many years before then that you had a guy on the Detroit Tigers who played first base named Hank Greenberg. And why Italian? Well, probably the best player in baseball at the time was none other than Joe DiMaggio. So figured, if it worked with DiMaggio and the Yankees, and if the Tigers did so well with Hank Greenberg, then maybe we too should invest in a Jewish boy to play for us. Now it did work. Next one, please. One. Jewish turnstile drive underway by they found their Jewish kid. Who is it? Dan Daniel, New York World Telegram and Sun. No less intense than was John J. McGraw's unceasing search for a great Jewish player for the Giants is the drive in that direction being made by Walter O'Malley. Only a few months apart were these articles of the Dodgers. O'Malley has revealed that in addition to pitcher Sanford Koufax, who received a bonus of $20,000 for signing, the Dodgers have 4 other Jewish players in their farm system. Now, you might be saying to yourself, 1 out of 4 ain't bad in baseball. But again, it procures a certain stereotype, fair, in this case, redounding, I suppose, to the athleticism of Jews. And it creates a certain sense of, even, I have to admit, I'm quite careful. I don't use like terms like Yiddish cup. I don't know any about you, but there's something about it that seems to elevate and indicate some certain characterizations of Jews, good or otherwise. But you can't have one, not the other. So turn the page. Oh boy, is that small. Let's bring it up. Press one more. There we go. Here is by Rabbi Charles Fleischer, a prominent rabbi at Adath, Israel, a very large Reform congregation in Boston. I'm trying to make sure that we migrate throughout the United States this afternoon. Trying my best. He offers the following editorial on the front page of the Boston Jewish Advocate with a very ominous title. The one book, which is a fantastic program, really, really is. I'm really grateful that Gratz is stewarding it. People love dead Jews. Well, on converting the Jews. By Charles Fleischer, they are after the Jews again, even in America. This is a very prominent, well-educated, not very attendant to saber rattling type of rabbinic personality. And nevertheless, they are after us Jews again. Even in America, there must be an occasional Jew hunt. else a certain type of militant Christian knows no peace in his soul. What he's referring to in the early 20th century is something that is as old as the Jewish experience in America, is missionary work. Many letters are written to the ADL, to the American Jewish Committee, every year about missionary work. Isn't there something you can do about it? Our children aren't feeling safe. What right does an evangelical or any type of Christian, whatever type of religion, have in trying to persuade we Jews to converting to their faith? And each time, what does the ADL respond? What do you think? There's not a thing that we can do about it. It is a marketplace of religion, equal opportunity. You can't do anything about it. Well, and nevertheless, there's something, and this is the Vatican II in the Catholic experience in the 1960s about a pledge not to convert Jews anymore. This is tied to support for Israel among the evangelical community. Is what do Jews do about this awkwardness, about this religious marketplace, about conversion in the United States? Missionaries, Horovai, actually, if you press the cue back one more time, go back, which one? So we can see the headline. 4 Little Roxbury, that's an area, a neighborhood in Boston. Roxbury, Jewish girls baptized. Dozens more taken in by missionaries. Parents horrified at discovery is the headline in the Jewish Advocate in the early 1930s. There was this missionary in Boston working in the West End neighborhood, an immigrant community that was very taken. Actually, she was totally fluent in Yiddish. Her name was May Hatch, and she had a summer camp. Why summer camp? Because immigrant Jews couldn't afford summer camp. Very hard for non-immigrant Jews to afford summer camps sometimes. And she worked to convert them. She baptized 4 little girls, and it even reached the Yiddish press in Der Tag about the challenge of converting Jews and the question and the upkeep of this discussion of what do we do in the religious marketplace does bespeak some of the challenges of having a fair and easy conversation about Jews in the United States. Make sure we cover everything. Next, parents save girls from baptism just in time. Go ahead. Here she's interviewed, is this missionary May Hatch, saying it's a free country, I can do whatever we want. The next is a little girl signed by one of the girls explaining the experience, essentially saying we had no scaffolding. Our parents didn't have any time for us. They're working tooth and nail to support us. I didn't have teachers. May Hatch was there for me. Page. And I want to go forward in time to Jap jokes. What do you think about Jap jokes? Are they much in vogue? I'm not a Jewish American princess, so I don't know. But there was, I think they are waning a little bit. Jap, not Japanese, but what does Jap stand for in American Jewish parlance? Is the Jewish American princess. There is a literature on this. What is the characterization? When we make a Jap joke, what does it indicate? Anybody? That's interesting. And Karen jokes are equal opportunity to a certain extent. Yeah. Which is amazing. It's very far away from the boxer of working class status. It is very different than the Harween brothers not looking to jeopardize their mother's good standing among the New York elites. It is when American Jewish experience has come full circle, which is actually really interesting. Gratz College has we have 2 flagship programs. One is our education program, our MED program. We have about 200 public school teachers who train with us. But the other program that we have is the world's leading graduate program in Holocaust and genocide studies. We have 150 students who 40% of them are public school teachers all over the world. Next to Pennsylvania, our largest cohort, we've got 20 students right now enrolled in they're teachers, they're public school teachers in the California school system. And it's really amazing to talk about the Holocaust. But of course, there are other conversations we can have about hatred. I made the argument in the Philadelphia Inquirer in an op-ed right after the Texas terrorist attack, whereas the Holocaust becomes an agent facilitating conversation about all other genocides, right? The curriculum at Gratz supposes that if our teachers learn in the 23 states, including Pennsylvania, have a Holocaust education mandate in the public schools. Let's try to understand that. Why does it have a Holocaust education mandate? On the one hand, to speak to certain anti-Semitic tropes, but also to facilitate further conversation around genocide. The Holocaust looms the largest, but of course, not of course, but the theory of change in the public school system suggests that if the certain values in combating hate and learning about the hatred of the Holocaust will also facilitate very helpful conversations, whether it's in African-American slave reparations or the Rwandan genocide. Unfortunately, hate is not a scarce resource, but that's exactly why the public schools have come to embrace this educational benchmark in their social studies or English literature curriculum. Well, what about anti-Semitism? Is anti-Semitism more helpful than other areas to understand hate? I think this is really at the core of Dara Horn's book. What is useful about anti-Semitism? Useful in talking and educating about anti-Semitism. In some ways, it defies logic, right? African-American racism, hatred towards people of color, towards certain genders, sexuality, that's a certain finite group. There's in a certain scope, a certain space of things. What I find useful about teaching about anti-Semitism as a symbol of all other hates is that it betrays notions of whiteness, of gender, of class, and perhaps Jap jokes more than any other are a useful tool to understand how pervasive hate can be. Because what is the Jewish American princess? It is the young girl whose family has made it, right? She's on the college quad. She has a credit card. She is in the in crowd at her public school, at her private, at her preppy school. This Jewish American princess, in some sense, is the protagonist that F. Scott Fitzgerald has made fun of in his books. She is the epitome of the Great Gatsby, and yet we make fun of her. And how we don't make fun of her. The Jap joke ridicules her. And in some sense, the utility of anti-Semitism, of talking about anti-Semitism, why it's useful pedagogically, educationally, to understand all varieties of hate, is specifically because of how pervasive it can be. You can attack Jews for not being Christian. You can attack them from an economic lens, from a racial lens, from a theological one. And altogether, it really shows just how pernicious hate can be. So let's take a look. For some variety of reasons not altogether clear to me, there were a series of articles that appeared about this Jewish American princess in the American mind. When I was 12 years old, writes an author in Lilith magazine, a feminist Jewish publication, my parents sent me off to Camp Ramah in the Poconos. Somebody just told me is that Philadelphia Jews founded Ramah in the Poconos? Okay, good to take credit. That June, I was a dull kid. In no small way, Camp Ramah transformed the conservative movement. Camping generally, whether it's Nifty, Camp Moshavah, it's amazing what camping has done to perpetuate and foster American Jewish life. I say that with all due candor. That June, I was a dull kid in an undershirt from Trenton, New Jersey, outfitted in a lime green mix and match irregulars from EJ, what is it, Corvettes? Yeah? All right, predates me. By the end of August, though, exposed as I was to for 2 months, to suburban Philadelphia's finest pre-adolescent fashion, I had contracted that dread disease, Chaplitis. Symptoms included not only the perfection of an elaborate all-day triple sync procedure for dyeing white and wool bobby socks to the requisite shade of dirty white, we called it oyster, but also my sudden ignominious realization that the discount Beatlemania record my mother had bought for me the previous spring was not, after all, sung by the real group. I'm not even sure that the term Jap existed yet back then. I don't think it did. But in any case, by October, I was more or less cured. I put the general themes of entitlement, of materialism, of canonized motifs. In those days, Lord and Taylor was the label of choice rather than Bloomingdale's. Lord and Taylor wishes that it was so still. At the back of my mental medicine chest for the next 2 decades. Go back to another article from the Long Island Jewish World. A little bit fuzzy, so I'll read out loud. Nobody in polite society today would use the word kike. Say it out loud. Said Usepti, chairwoman of the National Women's Issues Committee of the American Jewish Committee. No Jew would countenance that we have to do this. No Jew, would countenance that we have to do the same with Jap. The very expression of Jewish American princess sets her teeth on edge, said Septi. The issue is that we have a term here that I suspect in the past has been used with indulgence and humor, and now is being abused as a stereotypical and anti-Semitic definition, she said. Those working to erase the derogatory word are hard-pressed to pinpoint its exact origin, but they do trace the earliest uses of the characterization to contemporary Jewish writers, all male. The first Jap probably was Marjorie Morningstar, of course, of Herman Wouk fame, of Herman Wouk's novel, Septi said, and then there was Philip Roth, who gave us Goodbye Columbus. They didn't use the term, but they were describing indulged Jewish women. Next one. So a survey was commissioned. In the fall of 1986, Syracuse University sociology professor Gary Spencer was invited to speak about the subject of the Jewish American princess at the campus Hillel. Spencer teaches courses of ethnic minorities, specializing in the American Jewish community. He'd heard of the term Jap, but didn't know there was anything to give a speech about. When the Hillel president told Spencer that a Jap problem on campus, the sociologist, as well as the Jew in him, was intrigued. He agreed to give the talk, but needed time to gather information. So what did he find out? That what Spencer found was this. The stereotype of the Jap, a spoiled materialistic, it's amazing how many descriptions they have of it. Trendily dressed, shallow, whining, obsessive, obnoxious, show off, was pervasive in the 16,000 student campus, 25% Jewish, women perceived to be Japs, were taunted and verbally assaulted on campus. The Syracuse University pep band had a habit of leading thousands of football fans in chants of Jap, 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 whenever a well-dressed woman walked past the student section of the stands in the 52,000 seat stadium. The campus newspaper frequently ran Jap baiting cartoons. More disturbing, he found areas known as anti-Jap zones, demarcated with spray-painted swastikas. He also discovered virulent anti-Jap as well as anti-Semitic graffiti carved into wooden desks into the campus library. And so what I want to do right now is facilitate maybe a little bit of thinking about what does it mean to be elevated? Because if you ask a Jew on the street, first of all, do they know that term anymore? I don't think it was as in vogue as it was in the 80s and 90s. I personally don't hear it so much, but it really does give us a sense into what and how these terminologies, I'll go back again to the Lipstadt discussion of the clueless anti-Semitism and how it can very quickly be ramped up into something much more virulent, right? Is how to elevate from the Jap baiting to the swastika scribbling sense of anti-Semitism. It's almost like, to borrow from a term in drug culture, it's a gateway drug, isn't it? Is that when we allow these stereotypes to fester, what we're in danger not just is about creating certain characterizations. What we've also done is we've given a certain amount of slack, a certain amount of runway to develop far more pernicious forms of things that we more obviously describe as anti-Semitism. That's the other side of it. Whether we're talking about Jews in Hollywood, or if we're discussing how, I don't think we're batting at a high clip anymore, but at a certain point, 25% of Nobel laureates had claimed a sense of Jewish identity. But when we're doing that, aren't what we're doing in some sense is claiming some sort of Jewish gene? Aren't we claiming a certain characteristic in the case of the good, but also inviting some of the bad into it? That's the subtle form. When we countenance, when we talk about Jews in sports, when we talk about Jews in the movies, when we talk about certain characteristics that might invite missionary work, for instance, what we're doing is allowing stereotypes to take control of our language. That itself is rather unkind, but even more than that, I would submit it's exactly what Professor Gary Spencer found in Syracuse about 35 years ago, even longer, which is that when we allow those things to occupy our language, when we allow them into our lexicon and our speech, we invite certain characterization of hate, don't we? Not to say that it's elevated so quickly, but when you allow that nomenclature, when you allow that taxonomy for anti-Semitism, then the clueless form of anti-Semitism, and I'll stretch it even more broadly, the clueless form of hatred, you allow it to evolve. And in American Jewish community, but in an American community that is increasingly identified with hyphenization, where you are an American Jew, you are a LGBTQ American Jew, when we identify ourselves as having multiple identities, where we embrace ourselves as Jews of color in many instances, we complicate a Jewish narrative. But counterintuitively, when we become much more complicated and variegated in our communities, when we allow those stereotypes to take hold, then we are still, despite how complicated and colorful and textured the Jewish community is becoming, we allow those stereotypes to persist. And that's another form of anti-Semitism. And that's, I think, in some sense, my business here this afternoon is to move Dara Horn's book a little bit further, which is how the place that Jews occupy, that she's not promoting people love dead Jews. Most of you have read the book. No, it's not encouraging dead Jews. It's the fascination with the Jewish martyr. She has this wonderful chapter, for instance, about wondering what's the value in Anne Frank would be if she had survived such a thing. But part of the other thing is identifying the other indicators of anti-Semitism. It's not just the famous and more well-known cases of dead Jews. Sometimes it's in how living Jews and living non-Jews speak about the Jewish experience. When we reduce it to jokes and to sports players and to Hollywood and to Nobel laureates, what we've sensed is reduced what's the most powerful thing about Judaism, I can say about my Jewish faith and my Jewish identity, is the powerfulness, the power, the influence of being complicated. When life, I've learned that lesson over and over and again as a historian, that what's so marvelous about the American Jewish experience is just how nuanced, about how freighted and involved it is. And no tagline could possibly reduce Judaism to something much smaller than it is. It is a really interesting thing to study. It's exactly why anti-Semitism is such a profound subject, because it teaches more than just about hatred of Jews. It teaches about the American experience, about a complicated sense of history going on 300 some years now. That's the tagline it should be. That American Jewish history, it's complicated. all the other stereotypes, all the other characterization. To a sense, it is to reduce not just the Jewish people, but I would argue Judaism itself. Thank you so much.
We have a microphone.
So this actually has to do with you were talking about Jap and Jap jokes. And so I grew up in Brooklyn, so it's probably 80–90% Jewish, the areas that I lived in. And plenty of Jews told Jap jokes.
No question.
So this is a good example, going back to what you were saying with Deborah Lipstadt, the Jews intentionally, unintentionally did things that were anti-Semitic. And it was a point of pride to say that you weren't a Jap.
Yeah.
I think you have to be real careful about how
It's something that I can't put my finger on. I'll use the example of sports just so it characterizes it so well. I know of no Italian Jewish Hall of Fame, but there's not a single major Jewish community that hasn't an official or unofficial Jewish sports Hall of Fame. There's something about the Jewish experience in America that has compelled Jews to speak about themselves as a unit, both for good and for less than good. And in some ways, absolutely, the clueless anti-Semitism is unknowingly, it's clueless after all, is carried out by people who identify as Jewish. And as Jews perpetuate it, it becomes all the more challenging to stymie it. I agree. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to ask how we can deal with anti-Semitism other than help people within our Jewish communities understand what the anti-Semitic trope are and their history. What happens when there's an incident? What happens when a child comes home crying because of something he heard? Or somebody at work finds swastikas on the timesheet that's posted on the bulletin board. How do we deal with it? How do we speak to each other about it?
I tend to think, and this is the experience that I think most of our instructors at Gratz College and why the public school teachers who come to us in so many ways are explaining it, is that the usefulness, the utility of anti-Semitism to speak about the American experience, I think is a useful lens. On the one hand, the Jewish community, talk about a stereotype. So Milton Homerfarb is famous for in the 1960s, suggesting that Jews vote like Puerto Ricans and they earn like Episcopalians, right? To suggest that there's a certain wealth benchmark that Jews have reached where they ought to be voting like Republicans, and yet 80% of Jews vote Democrat each presidential election year in, year out. That too is a stereotype, which is deeply problematic. But when you can speak about anti-Semitism as a useful lens to understand all harbingers of hate, then all of a sudden you talk about privilege in a different way, because it's absolutely true that okay. So I think there is a challenge with addressing anti-Semitism in America. Because after all, there's no doubt that the Jewish experience in America has been quite kind. Both compared, it's called American exceptionalism, that American Jews have done better into this country. This country is a Medina shel chesed. This is a kind, there's a certain akar of gratitude that the American Jewish experience owes to its indigenous clients. There's no question about it. Am I back? Okay. That's all right. I'll just hold it for 10 minutes. So it's absolutely clear that if we want to talk about oppression and people who have not been given a fair shake in America, there are other communities that have done far worse than the Jews here in the United States. It's also true that if you are speaking about pogroms, in this class that I was happy to be a part of, so many wonderful people, we addressed Kishinev in 1903. We looked at Khmelnytsky in 1648. Yom HaShoah commemorates every year the worst atrocity maybe in humankind, the Holocaust, that is. And I think that one of the challenges in speaking about anti-Semitism is, does it rise? Does it rise? Right? Yes, the ADL counts number of instances of Jewish hate, and there are, of course, horrible, and I don't want to discount any of these things. What happened in Pittsburgh, what happened outside of San Diego, what we averted, but there's certainly trauma existing outside of Dallas. Those are horrific. Those are acts of terror. But most instances of anti-Semitism are much more subdued compared to what is going on in certain sectors compared to what the experience of the African-American community, of the gay community in Orlando, for instance, a number of years ago. What I have found is that to speak about anti-Semitism as a useful lens for all hate and how it complicates the business. There's this wonderful line in Driving Miss Daisy, which didn't make it into the movie, but it's when Daisy is being driven and she's reading her newspaper. It's about driving Miss Daisy after all. And she says to her chauffeur, African-American chauffeur, it's the point of the play, and she reads about the bombing. They were in Atlanta, the temple. There's a prominent congregation still in Atlanta. And there were a series of bombings of synagogues in the 1950s. And Daisy questions, well, why did they bomb a Reform temple? Don't they know that we're American? We're just like them. They should have bombed one of the Orthodox synagogues, maybe one of the conservative, not the Reform temple. What Uri is doing, there was no Daisy, what Uri is doing is capturing a sentiment about what it means to Americanize. And when we talk about these things, we've provided a useful language to talk about status and I think privilege in a useful way. And by speaking about anti-Semitism, about how to complicate the narrative, how it goes beyond the pigmentation of your skin or who you fall in love with, you speak about it in complicated ways, and you accomplish both. You accomplish outreach on behalf of people identified as Jews, but more than that, you can capture what is so wrong and complicated. I keep on using that word again because it's the best word for it, about hatred in America and elsewhere.
I was just in California. I actually really just flew in this morning. And I was at the Central Conference of American Rabbis Convention. And so it was really great to be with, there were 350 of my colleagues there with me, and it was really wonderful. And I was staying with a friend, a lifelong friend, grew up in the same synagogue and bar mitzvah and confirmation, who is a devout atheist and doesn't really connect and identify with Judaism at all. And so we have some really great conversations. And he was telling me about this book that his father gave him a number of years ago. And the book was something like, 200 famous Jews who make you, who are, make you reasons to be proud to be Jewish or something along those lines. And he said to his father when he gave him the book, if you're going to tell me that there's this particular football coach or whatever who's in there, don't get me started, don't bother. And so his father goes, well, 199. So there's this sense on some level of, and it speaks to, I think, on some level of what you just were talking about, that there's this pride of, a Jew who achieved some stature and then coupled with that, so what on some level, that from the Jewish perspective, okay, so we made it, but just because someone identifies as a Jew or is a Jew, what does that mean in terms of their Jewishness and how, you can be Jewish, but at the same time not necessarily be Jewish, and even if you're not being Jewish, someone can call you out for being Jewish. I don't know. I don't know if that makes.
No, and it's that tension, right? It's that tension. I'm glad the CCAR meeting wasn't in Cincinnati.
Unfortunately, there's not going to be a lot in Cincinnati at some point in the future, but
it really does speak. And this is, there are many ways to study American Jewish history. I studied with my mentor, was Jonathan Sarna at Brandeis. So I study at its core American Judaism. Others study American Jews. What I find useful about studying American Judaism is that it's so much in motion. Of what does Judaism mean? How does one identify about it? Who is speaking about this thing called Judaism? That in so many ways in my writing and in my speaking, I avoid the question of counting the number of Jews who are in any given Hall of Fame. But there's something very remarkably thin, I would suggest, about an American Jewishness, I hate to use these made up terms, that has to rely on that, has to rely on identifying every Sandy Koufax. Don't get me wrong, one of the greatest pitchers of all time. And it's not true that Hank Greenberg himself said that nobody stopped pitching him so they wouldn't break Babe Ruth's record. And it's also true that Babe Ruth in his prime was thought to have been Catholic, and there was a lot of nativism attacking him in the 1920s. He wasn't Catholic. But when we start to reduce people and faith in this way, for better or for worse, meaning if we push them up or we punch them down, we're encouraging a certain type of speech, which is part of that, what Lipstadt calls this clueless form of anti-Semitism. And it's a stereotype. In a sense, we want to capture an attitude. We want to capture a group. We want to talk about dynamics. And it's impossible to be speaking about millions of people, each differentiated based on their own personal experiences. Characterization is going to be a part of it. But how we can temper our conversation, to my mind, helps us reduce these challenges. And speaking about it really does help, I think, talk about not just the Jewish experience, but the American experience writ large. Sure, well, I can't see, but I'm happy to take on any questions on the Zoom screen. Sure. Or I can read. I don't know, there's nothing in the chat I see. Oh, I'm sorry. You can unmute yourself. I didn't realize. Sorry. Then you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. Otherwise, I can say thank you to everybody. What a marvelous sanctuary. This is such a wonderful space. Yeah, wow. Hey. Sure. Maybe we'll close with this. Yeah.
So you were mentioning that you teach Holocaust to various teachers around the country. Do they learn the role that the United States had in not participating in rescue during the Holocaust, actually being opposed to rescue, as well as post-Holocaust, when they kept the Jews in a displaced persons camps much longer than all other displaced persons, so that this anti-Semitism in the United States had a role in the Holocaust and continued after the Holocaust?
So the best work on the first point is Laura Leff's work, Buried Beneath the Times, another excellent, exquisite title about the New York Times, not avoiding discussion about the Holocaust, but bearing it on page 14, which is really important. Heidi Omer, one of our most recently minted PhDs, not Jewish, public school teacher, social studies teacher in the state of Maine, wrote on Maine local press's experience on talking and suppressing the Holocaust among the media in that time, in the 1930s, 1940s. And Heidi was very involved. She was the grassroots layperson who was responsible for creating the for state of Maine, but also African American education. We're really proud of her. I try to talk about her whenever I can. So thank you for that. It is true that that as much, when Jews came to the United States, they either heard one of two things. It was a golden Medina. Don't need know much Yiddish to know that means a golden state, a wonderful state, but also had to balance that with suppositions that it was a Trefina Medina. I think that it's more of a goldena than a Trefina, but at the same time, those are both parts of the same complicated past. And when you embrace that and you don't whitewash over it, you understand that all experiences are, I'll use the term again, incredibly complicated. And when our curriculum gets head on about the complications over FDR, who decided not to bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz. That was a calculated decision that he made. That's something that American Jews didn't want to talk about. So many, that FDR is what moved all Jews from left, very left, to the Democratic Party. So Jews were very much beholden to FDR. In fact, could have added in my list of Charlie Chaplin and Jay Gould, you could have added that Hitler, Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, thought that Roosevelt was perhaps Jewish. He wasn't. Dutch reform. But that is, I think that responsibly, it's important for educators to embrace that thick and complicated sense of historical data and to grapple with it, to try to make meaning of it, because nothing is so simple. Nothing is so simple in life. And I think anti-Semitism and the study of it really does highlight just how a privileged group is sometimes not so privileged, and what are the limitations of privilege, and the fact that this privileged group isn't always all that privileged. Good question. All right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. It was so marvelous.